Hey everybody. It's been a week actually since I last filmed my footage. So today I'll approach this topic a little casually, but I just want to make a reference to a common theological question which has been explored by Christians alike, or even the basis of society, people in general, how people should relate to one another as individuals, as collective. And this has to do with the question of friendship. In particular, to be more specific, what it means to love your enemies as to how you love your neighbors. And this is a very profound question, more profound than it actually portrays in real life, because I think that the origin of this question is very broad, yet it has a slightly twisted definition behind it. So you've heard this quote, love your enemies as to how you love your neighbors, or love your neighbor as yourself. It sort of has a similar essence behind it. And it stems from this general idea of what it means to be charitable out of a Christian conviction. So there's this reading that I just looked at earlier, which actually gave me a profound impression on friendship and enemies, and the role of friends and enemies. It's by an author called Gil Anidjar. So he's a French, I believe he's a professor of comparative literature in Columbia University. And the title of the book that he wrote, which I read, was called The Jew and the Arab, published in 2003, I think. So that was a 37-paged reading, which constitutes a lot of topics. And he goes on further from that very question, loving your enemies and treat them as your neighbors, into something which is profound, something that actually allows me to question whether or not it is worth actually being friends with somebody. And before I get into that, I'll start actually by talking and comparing Augustine's idea and Thomas Aquinas' idea on friendship and enemies. So these are the notes that I took from class and that I took by myself. According to Augustine, the love of the neighbor is equal to the love of the enemies, because in that sense, to make an enemy out of somebody, out of your neighbor, is to alienate that aspect, the godliness aspect within the neighbor. Because Augustine believes that the enemy and the neighbor are two parts that make up a person. And I don't know what influence he has on this. I wouldn't say that it is his Manichaean background or something else. But the point is that Augustine believes that the love of a neighbor is unchangeable and is eternal. And to love your neighbor requires loving your enemy, that enemy bit in yourself or with other people, in order to reach God's eternal kingdom of love. And that might sound a bit vague and abstract, which takes a bit of imagination. But Augustine is somebody who strongly believes that one cannot just declare that somebody is made up of it's a pure neighbor, made out of pure love, or a pure enemy made out of pure hatred or enmity, solely because he is of a isolated entity. So this was actually in reference of Augustine's encounter with the Donatists, one of the peoples that belong to a heretical Christian sect called the Donatism, I mean. So essentially, Augustine believes that the church is made up of a mixed body, or the Latin you would say corpus per mixtum, which means that you never know whether somebody is a pure Christian. You can only discover that if you're God, of course, but we're just humans, so we're limited. And that really, really strongly influences the way he views love and how we relate to one another via love. Even if it's just holding love by its own sake. We don't have to love someone out of necessity. We just love that person solely because we do. And we have the capacity to love somebody, even if that somebody is our enemy. So, he further divides the concept of love. Augustine further divides this by saying that love is divided into the account of enjoyment and the account of use. So, Augustine believes that we should enjoy the company of the neighbor and what he has to offer to us emotionally. But on the other hand, we also have to love them because one day we might actually gain benefit out of that person. And that in itself is actually not a bad thing. If the method is good, of course, it will lead to something good. That's according to Augustine. And that's what it is theologically acceptable as love. Because if you love your neighbor or your enemies, we could relate to the love of our enemies to the love of God. So, well, I'll get to it later. But for now, I just want to mention Augustine's conception of love. And now I'll move on to Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas' idea of true charity, he doesn't necessarily say love here. He says that he divides this idea further by saying that the enemy is solely an enemy. But just because he is an enemy doesn't mean that we must hate the enemy. Because the enemy is also a human being, so we also have to embrace them as human beings. I wouldn't say we would tolerate them, because in some ways, the word toleration or tolerance can be a little bit patronizing or a bit condescending. It's sort of like you're just leaving someone to die simply because you don't care about it. There's something uncaring about the word tolerance in a way, which is a bit ironic. So Thomas Aquinas divides this by saying that there is an essence in loving the enemy, and there is an accident in loving the enemy. And that is, like, coming back to my first point, that's because he believes that it is solely based on the idea that we believe that loving the enemy is a matter of necessity, because we need them at some point in our lives. For example, this is pretty common when you're engaging, back in the Middle Ages, when people were engaging with foreign nations, and exchanging some diplomatic negotiations or something like that. And you need their help, even if you don't completely agree with them. Maybe like back to World War II, Japan and Germany, when they allied together, the Axis powers with Italy as well. I don't know if this claim is correct, really, but it says that Hitler, even though he acknowledged the Japanese's competence, but he did see them slightly as a threat, in a way, because they're quite powerful in the past. I mean, the Japanese still is powerful, but just a bit differently. Commercially powerful. But anyway, so Aquinas divides the fake, or we would say fake caritas, and the true caritas. Caritas is the Latin for charity. So the fake caritas is based on charity of necessity, so you just simply love the neighbor because you demand you demand the enemy or the neighbor to work for you at some point. But the true caritas is going beyond the scope. You prepare yourself to love the enemy when the necessity arises. So you're not pushed, because that concept itself means that it is possible to love your enemy in the pursuit of God's kingdom. And it has a lot to do with perfection and readiness. What does it take to be ready to love your enemy? It takes a good attitude of mind. It takes some great moral awareness or mental awareness. And it takes resilience as well to face and stand up against your enemies. And Aquinas is famous for his proposition on the just war. Just war means, well, simply said, a war that is just, that is enacted via proper and peaceful negotiations. So Aquinas actually declared that in order to enact a just war, one must not engage in false promises or lies. So that means that you cannot engage in deception. Even if the person or the opponent that one is confronting is the enemy, that doesn't mean that we still have to deceive him. That means that you have to still respect him. Any agreements must be kept. Concealing from the enemy is permitted. It is not deception. Now that is based on page 29 on the Jew and the Arab in Anidjar reading that I've read. So yeah, that's what I've got for now on Aquinas and on Augustine. And now I will be moving on, just for a tiny bit, bear with me, on... I'll elaborate further on the technique of actually, well, not a technique really, the single points that we have to note on what it means to acknowledge your enemies as your friends. So of course, as I've said earlier in the very beginning of this video, I said that loving your enemy as to how you should love your neighbor is an equivalent to the phrase that Jacques Derrida, a philosopher, said that the best of friends can turn into the worst of enemies because there is a basis of fear, of the idea, the fear that our friends can turn away from us, can betray us, which creates a greater amount of enmity enmity compared to actually being betrayed by someone you don't know, or by an acquaintance. So, where there is a friend, there is an enemy within that friend. And a friendship of two good men cannot be carefree. Ignorance is what leads this man to ignore this, to be in denial of this enmity that can arise later on. But of course, that doesn't stop many people to be friends with people, with anybody, even if later on they would become enemies. I think that it is a form of preservation, in a way. In a way, God, if you think about it, when he allows us to be friends, I mean, to be friends with a certain someone whom we actually get along with, it's like a blessing. It's a blessing that he gave us, and it's a way to actually, for us to see his love through that friend, but also accepting the fact that, accepting and making us ready, training us to have the aptitude of mind, where if one day that friend will turn into an enemy, then we must be ready for it. But that doesn't mean that we should let that disrupt us to his kingdom up there. And, of course, with Jesus being the godly incarnate of God, we witness the becoming enemy of the neighbor. So, the neighbor and the enemy is the same entity, but they are both to be loved. So yes, that's all for today. Let me know what you think. Peace out.